Good evening to everyone. Thank you all for coming and taking the time to reflect and possibly learn and walk away more effective than we walked in. So I'll give some snippets from Muslim history. I wrote down some notes, so my mind fades. I can refer to them. Just a quick take on myself. I have been in the United States close to half a century now, and I have lived in other countries also while I was a resident citizen of the United States. I've lived in the Far East, in Korea, a little bit in Taiwan. I've lived in Europe. I was born in England, so I've lived there a little bit. My parents were from Kashmir, which is partially in India now, partially in Pakistan. I've spent time in Pakistan. But as you can tell, the majority of my life I've spent here in the United States. And I find this still, despite all the grievances that we have and all the complaints that we come up with, it's the most vibrant and fertile place for humans. And it still is, and it has possibly the best potential outcomes simply because of the intellectual independence that we enjoy and the principles, the founding principles of the country. There have been efforts to subvert them, but I believe eventually we'll overcome. So the Muslim perspective, I fully acknowledge everything Zach said. Jewish history and Jewish theology is very much part of the Muslim creed and the Muslim learning. So technically they are our elders from a theological perspective. Zach mentioned Spain. There was a fabulous civilization in Spain for about half a millennium, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived beautifully together. And at the turn of the millennium, at year 2000, National Geographic published a cover saying that New York City is the center of civilization. And 1 millennium earlier, at 1000, Cordoba was the center of at least Western civilization, if you do not count China, and though their history predates Western history. The fear factor generated against Muslims, we call Islamophobia, which is the othering process of Muslims, has its roots in 8th century Europe. The origins of the hatred of people from the Middle East is that old. The artificial constructs generated at that time about people who are worshiping the devil or worshiping a moon god, I mean, these people can't even get together and have a consistent story, because these things are nonsensical and they contradict each other. And they're unchanging people. They are people who will never be civilized. They are people who need to be eliminated. These exact same constructs were used against the Russians during the communist period. These exact same constructs were used against the Native Americans who needed to be eliminated from this land, which sadly was called Manifest Destiny after they were all wiped out. And other communities that have come slowly into the United States. When I came, every successful Italian was a mobster, had to have mob contacts, otherwise it could not be wearing a nice suit and be driving a nice car. Every black person was de facto a criminal unless proven otherwise. And these were the common narratives. We were hearing about shipping all the black people back to Africa because their job has been done. So something like a third of the Africans who were brought after being kidnapped sold, abused, beaten into the Americas for working in the farms and building the economies, they were Muslims. The people who navigated for Columbus were Muslims, and the people who outfitted his 3 boats, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, were also Muslims. But there's so much cultural wiping out of certain cultures, which seems to be, in our experience, a dominant driving force to try to wipe out a culture. Muslims, as most of you know, belong to every race on the planet, very similar to Christians belong to every race. So it is difficult to stereotype a Muslim as belonging to one particular race. But what we see from our perspective is the excuses against certain communities are different. In some communities, the excuse is cultural. Against some communities, the excuse is their habits or their genetic content. These are done by people who deny science. But the root cause of all this is racism. There is endemic racism, which is not unique to the United States. I have lived in different places and I've seen racism, which is absolutely amazing. It is not purely a white person infliction or affliction. This happens in most parts of the world. It happens in China, it happens in South America, it happens in North America, and in much of Europe. And this happens due to ignorance of people. And when you see, and I'm starting to step into the areas of, besides complaining, what can we do? I can complain for the next 6 hours, but I'll probably achieve nothing other than being recognized as a spectacular complainer. So, there are things we can do. These things affect children. So what can we do? Education is the biggest thing that we can affect. Education has to have a sincere moral purpose. If education is going to obscure history, obscure scientific facts, when you say some racial people are not capable of doing certain things, and when they do perform those things, those are not exceptions. They are disproving the ancient myths, ancient prejudices and superstitions. So we still are affected by ancient prejudices and superstitions, so as much as we would hate to want to believe that. So in education, we need to strive to overcome this raw ignorance where facts which are scientifically proven, repeatedly proven and demonstrated, they are denied. These things lead to societal problems where an entire group of people, like just a random example now, what's happening in India against certain people, they're being beaten up, killed, and lynched for eating beef. But only certain people are being lynched for eating beef. There's a lot more people eating beef, but they are not being targeted. And this is out of raw ignorance, and the motivations are political. When you see a deliberate obscuration of facts, obscuration of scientifically obtained data to generate emotion against someone or against some group, that is your raw politics. There is subjective political forces behind those things which push racism, which push for elimination of cultures, which push for elimination of languages. So we have to start at the root of education and fight for being all-inclusive in education. What kids are taught, that's the only way we will have a long-term change. I can recite stories of Islamophobia. It'll get nowhere. We have so much that goes on that is deliberately denied because it doesn't fit the hypothesis. So a mass shooting occurs and a few dozen kids are slaughtered in school. When that is ignored completely, but when a colored person commits one shooting of one person, It's supposed to be a terrorizing event which requires national attention, and it requires affecting bans on people, affecting government policy, etc. You can then tell that this is a deliberate, subjective act of dividing people, trying to wipe out ethnicities, wipe out races. These are all regressive forces, and we have to recognize them and get them out of our education system, and also get them out of the public discourse. Because that's the most powerful thing we can do. When we listen to all the narratives, all the examples of people being put into camps and being treated like animals, worse than animals. We go to Petco and pets.com and we find out how well animals are treated, but the same people will go and treat perfectly good humans as articles and not even as animals. So we can see the moral degradation. I'm not pretending to be a moralist, but there has to be a moral underpinning to every education, because the intent has to be sincere. If the intent is to harm other humans, then for me to say that I am pro-life, meanwhile I don't care if 1 million people get slaughtered, but I am pro-life. I mean, the moral discontinuity and insincerity is absolutely abysmal. And we cannot let that carry on in our discourses in the newspapers, on television, and on talk shows. We have to push against it. So when we see these things, and we see these common things. It is all rooted in education. We see things right now in Texas. They're modifying textbooks to eliminate the existence of slavery. This is how the existence of the Native Americans was eliminated. Right through the 1960s, the Native Americans were counted as lesser beings, and they started getting human status in the 60s approximately. And this only happened due to exposure. This only happened due to meeting the people, finding their humanity, finding the poetry they had written, finding the narratives they had written, and turns out they were just as good humans as almost anybody else. But due to politics, due to taking away all of this great green earth, they had to be wiped out. So these things don't stand. You know, there are two big founding issues with our nation here that we have to address. My niece asked me the other day, how do they teach about the Holocaust in Germany? And we have some family who've been living in Germany for 60, 70 years. And I said they have reconciled with it. They recognize it. They did it. They teach kids the real facts, that those were absolutely horrid, unequaled crimes against humanity, and that we cannot find excuses or try to condone them or make excuses for them. And then we have to step forward with a vow that we will be better human beings and never let that happen again. But here in the US, there are a few crimes that somebody else will address. We have still not reconciled with. So this propensity to continue to commit this racism, commit this cultural expulsion, denial of the humanity of people and children, this will continue. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the organizers.